Huh?
It's 5:04 and welcome into a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. I'm Nick Craig. Good morning to you. Well, a busy day in Raleigh yesterday as the General Assembly was sworn in for their 25-26 biennium session. That included the swearing in of all 170 members of the state legislature, 120 in the House, 150 in the Senate, those folks who will represent their constituents in the state legislature in Raleigh for the next 2 years. Elected officials and their families were present as they stood and took the oath of office, promising to uphold the U.S. Constitution as well as the state's Constitution. North Carolina Supreme Court Justice Paul Newby administered the oath of office to elected officials in the Senate chamber, and Associate Justice Tamara Berenger administered the oath in the House. Following the swearing-in ceremony, both chambers immediately began the official leadership election, similar to what you saw in the U.S. House of Representatives last week. In the Senate, Phil Berger was reelected as the president pro temp of the Senate, the leader there. And in the House, as we expected and talked about, Representative Destin Hall, the Republican from Caldwell County, was unanimously elected speaker there. We will have some audio from Destin Hall coming up a little bit later on this morning. In the House chamber, former speakers of the North Carolina House, including Representative Tim Moore and Senator Thom Tillis, were in attendance. And again, we'll hear some of those comments coming up here in just a few minutes. It's now 5:06, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. Now, 2 months removed from Election Day 2024, we continue to track details in the high-stakes race for the North Carolina Supreme Court. Our friend Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation continues with updates this morning. Mitch, we spoke in a lengthy discussion yesterday about the state Supreme Court taking this over. We've got some additional legal challenges and motions that have come forward in the last 24 hours. What's the latest that you're tracking on this Thursday morning?
There are a couple of major points that are of interest since the last time we spoke. Remember that this election took place, as you mentioned, more than 2 months ago. It's still unresolved. Without any sort of court order, the State Board of Elections was scheduled to vote on Friday to certify Democrat Allison Riggs as the winner in this election. But now, as we talked about before, the state Supreme Court has issued an order blocking that certification. One new piece of information of interest at the state Supreme Court level, the initial order as it came out and was just 3 pages long, it looked as if the vote was 5-1. One person was missing from that vote, Allison Riggs, who recused herself from an election that affects her direct job on the state Supreme Court. But it looked as if the result was 5-1, with the other Democrat on the court, Anita Earls, dissenting. Well, an amended order came out very late in the day on Tuesday that changed that calculation. It was actually 4-2 because one of the Republican justices, Richard Dietz, also dissented. Now, Dietz, in his dissent, said that he thought that there were a couple of pieces of Jefferson Griffin's legal challenge that actually had some merit. Dietz had some concerns about letting people vote in North Carolina elections if they've never lived here, and also allowing people to cast a ballot from overseas without any photo ID. But he said, despite those concerns, he would not have allowed Jefferson Griffin's legal challenge to move forward because of what he calls a state version of the Purcell principle. The Purcell principle is a federal legal principle that says you shouldn't change rules of an election very close to the time that an election is taking place. Richard Dietz says, basically, in this case, Jefferson Griffin is asking for a change in election law after the election has taken place, and so he would stop this process at this point. But he is in the minority, along with Anita Earls, and so because of a 4-2 vote, not 5-1, 4-2, the state Supreme Court has blocked certification of the state Supreme Court election at this point.
Now,
While
Mitch,
that's happening,
before you get to that next point, let me ask you on the comments there from Richard Dietz. That's essentially the same comments that the Democrats were making when this was under Richard Myers's jurisdiction in federal court. They claimed the same thing, that Jefferson Griffin was attempting, or his legal team is probably more accurate to say, was attempting to change some of these things after the fact. Interesting to hear that coming out of Supreme Court Justice Dietz.
Yeah, very interesting. And in fact, it was interesting that he got to the merits because he basically could have just said, "I dissent and think that that this is just something that's taking place after the election, and we shouldn't have any type of mischief that would come about when a losing candidate tries to change the rules of the road
Sure.
after the election has taken place." But he went beyond that and he said, "Look, I don't think the challenge involving the 60,000 ballots of the people whose voter registration didn't have a driver's license number, a social security number. I don't think that has any merit. But I do think these other two do have merits. The problem for Jefferson Griffin is this is something that should have been resolved before an election, not after an election has taken place." So Dietz was a dissenter along with Anita Earls, who had some of the concerns that we've heard Democrats talk about now for weeks as this has dragged on. The second major development is that while this is happening, there's also action at the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals at the federal level. What happened was initially Jefferson Griffin filed his complaint trying to block the election certification at the state Supreme Court. That was in the middle of December. The very next day, the State Board of Elections had the case moved to federal court. And so the case was sitting with U.S. Chief District Judge Richard Myers until earlier this week. Myers decided, I should not deal with this issue. This is something the state court should deal with. So he sent it back to the state Supreme Court, made that decision, and at the very same time sent the case back and closed down the case in his courtroom. So the State Board of Elections is trying to get the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals to reverse that decision from Judge Richard Myers and to force him to take the case back from the state Supreme Court. So there's paperwork at this point that from Jefferson Griffin, Allison Riggs, State Board of Elections, all at the federal level, trying to get the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals to get the case back to the federal courts. And so it'll be interesting to see, once all of that paperwork has been filed, whether the Fourth Circuit will step in and try to force the district judge, which is at a lower level in the federal court system, to snatch the case back from the state Supreme Court, even after the state Supreme Court has already taken the case and taken steps to block the election certification. So we'll have to watch how all of that plays out in the days ahead.
Mitch, in wrapping up our conversation this morning in your update, is it still fair to say that as of right now, this Friday date, the 10th that was discussed, and the time in which the election could have potentially been certified, is that still on the chopping block as of right now and is likely not to happen?
It looks very unlikely that there will be a certification on Friday the 10th. Now, if the state Supreme Court's schedule stays in place, we couldn't see any sort of action before late January because they have various filing deadlines that go through January 24th. If the Fourth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals steps in, even then, we're getting so close to that Friday deadline that you think that there would be at least some slippage between the time the Fourth Circuit orders something and the time that all of the wheels turn around quickly enough to get something done. So it looks very unlikely that there would be a certification on January 10th. Now, in Allison Riggs' latest court filing, she just hopes to have everything resolved now by February 11th, which is when the state Supreme Court is supposed to come back in session. She keeps her job between now and then regardless, but she would like to have the whole thing resolved so that she will actually have her election certification and officially be a justice by the time the state Supreme Court gets back into action in early to mid-February.
A lot of moving pieces here. We appreciate the update. Mitch Kokai from the John Locke Foundation joins us on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:13, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We're going to look at your early your early trek into work on Thursday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. And
your emergency situation station.
Huh?
It's 5:20. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. Continuing to track one of our breaking stories across the state this morning. The two candidates in North Carolina's November the 5th Supreme Court election did file competing documents just before noon yesterday at the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Both addressed the federal appellate court's role in resolving an election dispute that has lasted at this point more than 2 months. The State Board of Elections urged the Fourth Circuit this week to reverse a federal trial judge's decision on Monday to send the election dispute back to the North Carolina Supreme Court. Appellate judges set a noon Wednesday deadline for Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin, a state appellate judge, to respond to the request for a temporary administrative stay. As we talked about earlier this morning and yesterday, the North Carolina Supreme Court did vote 4-2 on Tuesday to block the certification of Jefferson Griffin's election against opponent incumbent Democrat Allison Riggs. The state's highest court set up a briefing schedule in the case that now lasts through January the 24th. The court order stopped the election board from moving forward with plans to certify Riggs as the election winner as early as tomorrow, the 10th, Friday. Riggs leads Griffin by 734 votes out of more than 5.5 million ballots that were cast in the election. Griffin and his team seek to throw out more than 60,000 ballots that they have labeled as unlawful. Potentially some additional movement on that throughout the day today, maybe getting something from the 4th U.S. Circuit. We'll keep a close eye on that. We'll have details at carolinajournal.com and, of course, coming up for you tomorrow morning, Friday, right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour, where it's now 5:22, News Talk 1110 99.3 WBT. You may or may not have heard of the term franchise tax and why that is relevant here in North Carolina. It is a pretty big deal, and to get some additional details on that this morning, it's my pleasure to welcome the CEO of the John Locke Foundation, Donald Bryson, back to the Carolina Journal News Hour this morning. Donald, you have an opinion piece up a couple of days ago talking about the franchise tax. Can you give our audience kind of a brief overview of what a franchise tax is and why it's relevant to citizens here across the state of North Carolina?
Sure. First off, good morning, Nick. Thanks for having me on. It's always a pleasure to be on and talk to this audience. It's a great audience. Sure. So a franchise tax is several states have had it over the years. There's been a trend in recent years of states phasing them out or repealing them entirely. We've seen states like Oklahoma and Connecticut move to get rid of theirs. But other states, some states call it a franchise tax. Some call it a capital stock tax. Either way, it's the same thing. Basically, it is a tax on the value of a company that is doing business in North Carolina. That doesn't mean that they necessarily have a physical location in North Carolina, but if they do business in North Carolina, then they pay the state franchise tax. So it's not a tax on having a franchise type business. You know, if you open up a Chick-fil-A, it's not a special tax for them, or a UPS store or something like that. It's not a special tax for them. It's on basically any business in North Carolina. So any C Corp or any S Corp, which includes sole proprietorships and LLCs, they pay a minimum $200 tax, but you pay basically on the value of the company that you have over a certain amount of money. And so essentially what the state is doing is that it is taxing the physical investment that companies make in North Carolina.
And why is that an issue? I mean, we've seen massive business growth in the state over the last couple of years. It was just a few years ago that CNBC ranked the state of North Carolina #1 state for business back to back. Why is something like this relevant, and what needs to change in your mind from the General Assembly standpoint?
Sure. So, a franchise tax is a great example of a tax of we're going to tax somebody for the simple fact that they can afford to be taxed. It's not because it does any good. There's already a privileged licensing fee that the state has put on businesses in the past, and basically to register your business in the state. This is an additional tax, whether you make a profit that year or not, on the value of your company. So think about how big of a footprint that the banks down in Charlotte have, like Bank of America or Wells Fargo or even Duke Energy, right? So they have to pay on the value of their company, which is not just about stock value, but it also includes buildings, how many employees they have, how many computers they have, how many warehouses they have, how many vehicles they have. They're paying all of that. That means that also applies to, something like Bill's Plumbing up the street. I'm just making up a company, but think about a plumber shop, right? They have to have a warehouse where they have all of this inventory of pipe and ductwork and things like that. They have to have the building itself. They have to have employees. They have to have work vans. They have to have work equipment. And so they're paying taxes on all of that in addition to any income tax that they have to pay, in addition to any sales tax, in addition to any property tax, and the privilege licensing fee. And so basically, if a company decides to honor the state with opening up and doing business in the state of North Carolina in some capacity, we are taxing them for that, which is even sillier when you think about how much energy the state puts into big incentive programs like JDIG or the One North Carolina Fund to incentivize companies to come here, only to then to tax their investment.
Well, and we've seen in proof, and we've heard rhetoric from Republicans in the General Assembly even as early as yesterday with the swearing in of new members in the House and the Senate about making North Carolina a more friendly place for business and attracting more of that business here, competing with our neighboring states that, as you note, are offering incentive packages, whether it's South Carolina, Georgia, Virginia. Do you think this would help in that incentive to states, or in the incentive rather to companies to move their business here to the Tar Heel State?
I think it has to. I mean, most of the 16 states that still do levy a franchise tax are in the South, which means that we would, in fact, have a leg up over them, a tax that we are not levying on these investments that companies want to make in North Carolina if they decide to come here. There's a national trend, as I mentioned earlier, of just getting rid of these taxes altogether. One, the tax itself doesn't make sense, and two, it doesn't bring in relative to the size of the state budget, a ton of revenue. We bring in between 34 and $35 billion a year. I think in the last full fiscal year, it brought in about $770 million, so about 2.2% of all revenue. And it seems to me that this is one of those taxes that actually might pay for itself, where we phase it out and companies are then able to use that money to invest in more businesses or invest in more employees, in wage growth, or more businesses might want to move here. More businesses might want to open up. And so we have more economic activity in that way. The growth may outweigh the revenue that we bring in.
Has this been something that has been discussed or thrown around? We know that there's a lot that moves in the General Assembly every 2 years when they start their long session. Has there been any discussion on this in the past that you're aware of?
There has been discussion on this and of getting rid of it altogether or phasing it out. It was 2 years ago the General Assembly passed the state budget, and they capped the maximum amount that could be paid by someone in the franchise tax, which it capped at $1 million. Which, if they capped it at $1 million, that tells you that the bulk of it is going to be disproportionately paid by smaller businesses. This is not, large businesses are in fact paying money into the franchise tax, and they were paying a lot more, but now disproportionately, it's the small businesses up and down Main Street that are paying it rather than the large, C corps.
Well, and it's interesting you bring that up, because in the future, if things stay the way that they are in the General Assembly, we will be moving into having no corporate income tax in the next couple of years, according to some plans from the General Assembly. So it seems like, Donald, on one side, they say, come on, corporations, come on, business, bring it here to the state. And then maybe on the other hand, they're saying, but hey, you're going to have to pay, if you're a large business, at least $1 million a year up to that point in this tax. It's kind of almost maybe a conflicting message.
It absolutely can be a conflicting message. And there are a lot of people out there that are going to say, well, we need a corporate income tax and we should be, businesses should be paying their fair share. Well, that's true maybe if businesses are in fact people, but they're not people. Businesses don't pay taxes. Businesses pass through taxes. So what we're seeing is they're paying their taxes, but we're seeing it in terms of lower wages, lower employment, or higher prices for whatever product they're providing. And so we're all paying those taxes one way or the other. It's just people on the left or whatever seem to be happier about it showing up on the tax forms of the corporation, but we're all paying those taxes. We may as well just stop acting like they're not passing through the costs and get rid of the taxes altogether so that we can have higher wages and lower costs.
Donald, you've got some more details in your piece that we don't have a chance to get into this morning. Where can folks check that out?
They can check it out at carolinajournal.com in the opinion section. Talk about how ending the franchise tax here in North Carolina could spur economic growth.
Donald Bryson joins us this morning on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Where it's now 5:30, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We'll get a look at your traffic on a Thursday morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thank you, Nick. So far,
WBT.
Hot.
It's 5:36. You're listening to the Carolina Journal News Hour, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. If you miss any portion of our show this morning, I encourage you to check out our podcast. It's available wherever you get your shows. Just search for the Carolina Journal News Hour. Tap the subscribe or follow button, and you'll get a new show delivered to your smartphone or tablet each and every weekday morning. It's the Carolina Journal News Hour podcast. Download and subscribe now. As I mentioned earlier, the North Carolina General Assembly, their 2025-26 biennium began yesterday with the swearing in of all 170 members of the state legislature. And, well, things are going to be a little bit different, at least on the House side. Tim Moore, who was the House Speaker up until this year, is now up in Washington, D.C. He is a member of Congress. And with that, Representative Destin Hall, who is a Republican from Caldwell County, was unanimously elected Speaker of the North Carolina House yesterday. And he spent some time speaking to his colleagues, both Republican and Democrat, about the importance of the General Assembly for this legislative session and the work that they are going to have to get into. A lot of priorities for the General Assembly. Let's take a listen to some comments from the new House Speaker in Destin Hall.
And so our job here as members of this House is to do all that we can to make sure the people of this state also have the opportunity to experience that American dream like all of you all who have served in this body. There are a number of folks, everyone here who's serving has had success in their careers and in their communities. Our number one job here is to make sure that we make it as easy as possible for the folks of our state to also live that American dream. And the first way that we go about doing that is making sure we continue to secure North Carolinians' economic future. And thankfully, since 2011, a lot of the work has been done. As we know, we've cut taxes again and again. We've put more money back in the pockets of the citizens of our state. We've got one of the best tax environments in the country, and we're going to continue to provide tax relief to North Carolinians. But we've got to do more than just cut taxes. We've got to be creative in how we provide economic opportunity for the citizens of our state. We've got to encourage business expansion and job growth in North Carolina. The states who are around us, they're serious about job growth, and we're competing with them. And we've got to reject policies that make our state less attractive for business. We've got to build a business climate that's going to reward high wages, high benefits, and upward mobility for everyone. But a big part of economic success, of course, is education. And we've got to work to continue to invest in and nurture the education system in North Carolina, and that's at all levels, the K-12, community college, and the university system. Our North Carolina's competitive advantage really lies in our best asset, and that's our people. We've got a great tax environment. Other states have a good tax environment as well, but why do we continue to grow at a higher rate than almost every other state? And the reason is our human resources, the people of this state. We've got probably the best university system in the world, in the UNC system, incredible K-12 and community college system as well. And we can't lose sight of the fact that that is North Carolina's competitive advantage. And I'm proud of some of the things that this body's done during my time here over this is my fifth term, so the prior 4 terms. We've done things like expand school choice, letting parents decide where their children go to school, giving parents the opportunity to go to schools that best meet their particular child's need. And we need to continue to expand that school choice. We've increased funding, and we've pushed it into the classroom and away from bureaucrats in the school system. We've increased teacher pay with every budget. We've prioritized our community colleges and the type of programs where they partner with employers who come into areas so that folks in those areas can get high-paying jobs. We've also kept tuition incredibly low at the UNC system. So not only is it probably the best university system in the world, it's one of the cheapest. And therefore, it's one of the best values in the entire world right here in North Carolina. We've got to guard that competitive advantage that we have. But there's more to do on top of that. Just like it was for me with the encouragement I had from my grandparents, the most important factor in education for any child is parental involvement. And that's not an easy solution, or it's not an easy problem to find a solution for. But I can tell you this, that anything that this body can come up with that incentivizes parents to be involved in their children's education, I'm for. And we need to work to do those things because it's so critical to the success of young kids and their education. We got to continue to invest in our teachers. We need to incentivize them to go to school here, get their educations in North Carolina, and then stay here to teach after they graduate. Teachers are professionals, and we ought to let them go into the classroom and teach and get the government out of their way. Let them do the job that they were trained to do. And the last thing is especially important to me. We've got to figure out ways to incentivize people like me from rural North Carolina who left to go get an education, incentivize them to go back to rural North Carolina. You know, I saw firsthand the benefits of going back to those places because they're thirsting for young folks. They're thirsting for leadership, thirsting for people to be involved in those communities. Many of you all in this body, as I look out today, serve in rural North Carolina, and you know what I'm talking about, the difficulty in getting young folks to come back. We've got to incentivize those folks to come back. The other thing we've got to do very quickly and work hard at is we've got to lower the cost of living. The fact is right now in North Carolina, just like so many places across the country, folks' budgets are tight. Their groceries and gas and their other goods have gone up. And we've got to do what we can at our level to help meet the needs and try to lower the rising inflation in our country. And we do that by things like helping with child care. We do that by working to lower energy costs and health care costs in our state. Of course, it's a federal government issue in many ways, but we have a role to play. And I think that this body needs to be laser focused on that from the very beginning. We've got to offer some real solutions to it to the extent we can do that on the state level. And with all that said, our agenda here, it's not going to matter very much unless we do the number one thing that government has to do, and that's to keep our people safe. I'm proud of some of the things this body's done over the course of the last several years. We passed a bill that was actually my bill last session requiring our law enforcement to cooperate with immigration authorities at the federal level to help deport illegal aliens who are committing serious crimes in our state. You've seen us crack down on drug dealers who are selling drugs that kill people. And we've even amended the Constitution to make sure that the victims of crime also have rights just like those who have been charged with crimes. And we've got to continue to enact those policies to meet the number one obligation of government. And so I hope that we'll work with the incoming administration in Washington, crack down on gang activity and trafficking in drugs that are devastating so many communities across North Carolina. And we need to support law enforcement. We need to give them the funding and education that they need, legal protection, and recognize them for the heroes that they are. And then finally, let's spend the dollars that we need to keep our schools safe. Let's make sure every school has a resource officer, invest in technology to make sure that when our kids go to school, they're safe there. I've talked so far a lot about the issues that face the entire state, but I do want to make one thing clear. The number one priority of this body, starting today, because today is day one, is doing all we can to rebuild Western North Carolina. To my friends in the mountains in the West, know that you're not forgotten. Know that this body is going to put you all as the number one priority, our number one fix as we come in this session. We're working on some of those things now. It's going to be a long road to recovery. There's more than $50 billion probably in damage, but this body is committed to doing everything possible to build back Western North Carolina and build it back stronger than before.
That's House Speaker Destin Hall yesterday in Raleigh with the swearing in of the 25-26 biennium for the General Assembly, talking about the priorities for the House Republicans and Democrats that he will be leading in the General Assembly. Obviously, the top priority there, as he mentioned, Western North Carolina relief and recovery. The General Assembly is expected to, they gavelled out yesterday, they are expected to reconvene on January the 29th, so coming up here in a few weeks to begin the work of that long session. It's now 5:45, News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We'll get a look at traffic this morning with Boomer Von Cannon.
Hey, thanks, Nick and North.
It's 5:49. Welcome back to the Carolina Journal News Hour. News Talk 1110, 99.3 WBT. We just heard some audio from House Speaker Destin Hall as the General Assembly was sworn in yesterday as they will begin their biennium. And obviously the big priority this year is the state budget. That happens every 2 years. Shifting dynamics, Destin Hall, now the Speaker of the House, former House Speaker Tim Moore, now up in Washington, D.C., but of course, on top of all of this, you've got a brand new governor in Josh Stein in the governor's mansion, and it is still yet to be known how exactly he will work with the General Assembly. Former Governor Roy Cooper in his later years definitely had a less than ideal relationship with the General Assembly. Veto overrides consistently. The power structure in the House and Senate, very similar, not exactly the same. In the Senate, Republicans do have the majority. They also have the veto-proof supermajority. And in the House, it is Republicans that are one vote shy of that supermajority. So it will be very interesting to see how that plays out. Again, as I mentioned, the General Assembly is set to be back in Raleigh about 3 weeks from now. They'll be back on the 29th. That's when they will begin their work for the long session. Obviously, as we heard the ending comments there from Destin Hall, really the top priority of lawmakers when they gavel back in later on this month is going to be dealing with the relief out in western North Carolina. On top of that, there will, of course, be new decision makers, new policy makers in Washington, D.C., the Trump administration, the inauguration happening on the 20th. So there will probably be some big time changes at the federal level in terms of FEMA and federal government funding. You've heard some discussions from individuals like House Speaker Mike Johnson about one large bill right off the bat to get some of these balls rolling, and some of that could include relief not only from western North Carolina, but of course portions of western Florida, and now on our eyes, portions of the Los Angeles area that have been devastated by wildfires that have been burning now for 2 days. So there's going to be a lot that goes on. We will keep a close eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. The dispute over North Carolina's November the 5th Supreme Court election does continue this morning, with conflicting filings at the 4th U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. Republican candidate Jefferson Griffin and the State Board of Elections are contesting jurisdiction after a federal judge in Richard Myers remanded the case to the state Supreme Court earlier this week. Democrat Allison Riggs leads Jefferson Griffin by 734 votes out of more than 5.5 million cast in the contest, but Griffin and his legal team seek to discard over 60,000 ballots that they deem unlawful. The state Supreme Court has blocked the certification of Riggs's election, which was slated to happen potentially as early as tomorrow morning, setting a briefing schedule through January the 24th. Riggs argues that Griffin's efforts to disqualify ballots undermine public confidence in the statewide elections. Meanwhile, Griffin insists that state courts should decide the case without interference from federal proceedings. Both sides are pressing for clarity. Riggs seeks to expedite the decision from the Fourth Circuit. That would be re-elevating this case to the federal level, while Griffin argues for allowing the state Supreme Court to resolve the state law issue in itself. The controversy has left Riggs holding over in her current position without certification for her new term as this legal battle unfolds. So as we continue to watch this process unfold in North Carolina, the certification, again, is not expected to happen tomorrow. I would suspect that we potentially could hear something from this Fourth Circuit either today or tomorrow. Mitch Kokai over at the John Locke Foundation keeping a very close eye on that. We, of course, are keeping an eye on it well. We'll provide additional details at carolinajournal.com, and as soon as we get them right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. Taking a look at some other statewide news this morning, as you heard Boomer talking about throughout the show, transportation authorities are preparing North Carolina roadways for slick conditions as weather forecasts up and down the state from the Tennessee border all the way to the Atlantic Ocean show snow in many areas, including Raleigh, Charlotte, Durham. The Highway Division 5 of the North Carolina Department of Transportation began a large-scale salt brining operation on Wednesday morning as they are continuing their preparations through Friday when the storm is predicted to move into areas across the state. And while they were able to stay out of rush hour traffic Wednesday morning, authorities did warn during a press conference that they would be out in evening traffic yesterday, and they will be out throughout the day today. So keep that in mind if you are going to be out on the roadways, that there could be some delays as the DOT throughout the state will begin and has already begun and will continue beginning to lay salt in those areas. Doug McNeil, who is the division maintenance engineer for Division 5 of DOT, says this is a little different event. We're 72 hours out, this was, of course, a couple of days ago, before anticipated snow. But with the cold temperatures, it really reduces our window of where we can actually take and apply the brine. We're looking for mid-20s and sunny as a good start for us. Tomorrow and the next day will be focused more on the interstate system where we have higher speeds and higher volumes. Division 5 is responsible for more than 15,000 lane miles across Durham, Franklin, Granville, Person, Vance, Wake, and Warren counties. With a robust contract operation, DOT says roughly 350 trucks will be operating in that road coverage area. Similar things happening in other DOT regions across the state. The region will have nearly 14,000 tons of salt available, with 2 salt brine plants in both Wake County capable of producing more than 320 gallons of that brine per minute, with distributing it throughout the 15,000 miles of interstate there. The thing that's making this storm rather complicated is there could be areas where you've got a mix of freezing rain, then turning into snow, that snowpack, then allowing that those frozen roadways to continue to stay frozen for a longer period of time. And as we look at the time where this is affecting, you'll look at the central part of the state throughout the day on Friday as you head east towards the coast. The rain and mixed condition, not expecting snow out east, will start to take place through the latter hours of the day on Friday and into the early hours of Saturday morning. Some winter weather expected. It doesn't happen very often across some of our major metros, Charlotte, Raleigh, Wilmington. However, we are keeping an eye on it right here on the Carolina Journal News Hour. We'll get some additional details with Brianna Kramer from the Carolina Journal coming up on these operations tomorrow morning. That's going to do it for a Thursday edition of the Carolina Journal News Hour. WBT News is next, followed by Good Morning BT. We are back tomorrow morning, 5 to 6 a.m. right here on News Talk 1110 and 99.3 WBT.